The European Union is considering sanctioning 8 Chinese companies accused of aiding Russia's war in Ukraine. The proposed measures are part of a renewed push to prevent Russia from accessing equipment that could be used in weapons. Some of the firms in question have already been blacklisted by the United States. Beijing says it will retaliate against any EU sanctions. For more on this, let's bring in DW correspondent So Tung Hai in Taipei. Hi, So, good to see you. How exactly are the companies on this list thought to be aiding Russia's war machine?
Well, Kate, the Ukrainian army is fighting more and more Chinese parts in Russian weapons used in the war, especially the electronic components. For the 8 Chinese companies, most companies are electronic distributors. Their products can be used by Russian companies to supply military equipment. For example, the Hong Kong-based Kimpai Technology supplies microelectronic products to Russia for weapons applications such as cruise missile guidance systems. Another company, Sino Electronics, supplies items to Russian defense procurement giant Radio Apto Matika that are on the Western sanction list. So now it's time for the West to, we know that Russia's supply of parts of the West has been limited by sanctions. So now it's time to stop China from doing so.
Now, so China says it would react, quote, strictly and firmly to any EU sanctions. How might that response look in concrete terms?
Well, the Chinese government always like to use the same level countermeasures to retaliate. It's very likely that they will ban the import and export business of Western military companies, like what they did to Lockheed Martin or Raytheon Technologies in the US. To further delve into this issue, we have to know one very crucial material. That's the rare earth from China. For example, it takes more than 300 kilograms of rare earth to make one F-35 fighter jet. China is currently the strongest supplier of rare earth and holds the world's leading rare earth processing technology. So if China bans the exports of its rare earth to Western military companies, the cost is huge.
Now, so China-EU ties are complicated, to say the least. How do you see this particular move shaping the relationship in the future?
Well, the relationship between the EU and China now is like a tic-tac-toe game. You wait for the other's move to decide your next step. EU top officials have said in China that how China continues to react to Putin's war of aggression will be the decisive factor in the future relationship between the EU and China. Beijing stressed that China has not sold weapons to Russia, but the EU now is taking a huge step here to echo the Biden administration's warning, telling China not only just weapons, but also items that could be used in military activities should be on the watch list. So it's China's turn now to decide it has the ball, and we'll see how China will continue to play this game.
It's a high-stakes game of tic-tac-toe there. Sun Sang-hang in Taipei, thank you very much. And German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has also been weighing in on the question of EU-China ties. Take a listen to what he had to say in an address to the European Parliament.
Our relationship with China is aptly described by the terms partner, competitor and systemic rival. And here rivalry and competition on the part of China have undoubtedly increased. The EU sees this and the EU is reacting to it. I agree with Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. There should be no decoupling, but smart de-risking.
I'd like to bring in Professor Jörg Rocholl now. He's the president of the European School of Management and Technology and has been looking closely at the question of de-risking and decoupling. Professor Rocholl, what does being a competitor and a systemic rival of China actually mean in policy terms?
So, as the Chancellor said, there are different aspects in which we can describe the relationship between Europe, Germany and China. And it's very important to keep all these elements in mind. At the same time, it would be unwise to decouple the relationship. This is a mutually dependent relationship between China and Europe. And therefore, I would strongly argue in favor of diversification. So this means obviously to keep and strengthen the ties to China, but to strengthen them even more with other partners around the world.
Yeah, and as you say, the whole question of decoupling and de-risking means increasing self-reliance, doesn't it, whether in supply chains or access to raw materials. How equipped is the EU to lessen its dependence on China?
So we need to differentiate between the supply chains and the sales markets. When we look at, for example, the situation when it comes to Russian gas, Russian coal, or Russian energy, we saw that the diversification went very quickly. It was very comprehensive. And so the diversification was a success up to this point. It's different when we look into sales markets. So in this case, it is not that companies don't want to sell in other markets, but some of these markets are not yet as developed as they would need to be in order to sell products there. So therefore, it is important that we take a long-term view, and we take a view at those markets that can develop and also becoming more important in selling products there. And we've seen a couple of these advances now when it, for example, comes to Indonesia, to Vietnam, certainly to India, and probably more countries to follow.
Yeah, and I want to look at another key relationship now, the transatlantic one. The EU has been scrambling to forge its response to the US Inflation Act, which it feared could cause an exodus of companies to the US. Has it managed to ward off that danger?
So first of all, it is important that Europe and the United States need to continue talking about what exactly is entailed in the Inflation Reduction Act to really find ways in order to take out those parts that are really protectionist and rather only serve the interest of their home industry. At the same time, I would strongly argue in favor of not reacting in the same way on the European side, but rather using the available means in a more efficient way. And that means in particular also thinking about how to increase the supply of green energy by simply strengthening and making more efficient the processes by which energy supply can be built. And so far it has taken far too long for the supply to really be built. And this needs to be fastened and made much more efficiently.
We do seem to be entering a new era of state subsidies, though, don't we? Whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act or the Green Industrial Plan. Do you think this is a race to the top or a race to the bottom?
So it is not advisable to really follow this as basically a race to the top in sense of putting even more on top of the existing measures, but rather to remind us that global wealth, global welfare is heavily dependent on free markets and free markets between, in particular, the United States and Europe. And to strengthen these markets should always be the focus of the discussions that are now taking place on the political level between the United States and Europe, and really trying to think about how a common market, in particular also for innovative and green products, can be established on both sides of the Atlantic.
All right, Jörg Gochel from the European School of Management and Technology, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.